The first thing I noticed was that she didn't blink. It was an absurd detail to cling to amid crystal and orchids, cameras and applause. The cathedral around us had been dressed by people who knew the difference between taste and ostentation, and everyone else saw only the pageantry. They saw the chandeliers flaring like stars, the pews full of silver-haired patrons in tailored coats, the soft white carpet laid like a river to the altar. They saw my family, practiced in the art of appearing untroubled beneath scrutiny. They saw Isabella in a gown that seemed stitched from moonlight. They saw what they expected, an ascension made public. I had been watching her for weeks, months perhaps, and I had not, until that moment, imagined that a refusal to blink could be noticed. It is not, after all, an attribute we file alongside hair color or laugh. Yet there it was, an exquisitely small wrongness that pulled everything taut the way a single loose thread will unravel embroidery. Her lashes rested like shadows across porcelain lids. Her eyes held everything. The chandeliers, the faces, the bright lenses aimed at us, and held nothing the way a painting might. We had rehearsed the smile. I had practiced the angle at which to accept her hand. The priest had practiced, though he kept losing his place in the printed program, and the photographer had rehearsed where to stand while praise and pleasantries moved like ritual weather around us. No one seemed to notice the pause at the edge of her stare. No one asked. No one blinked for her. Perhaps this is why no one noticed how the air changed when the officiant's sentences slid from legalese into language that felt older than the stone around us. It started as a cadenced reading, vows and promises, the clink of glass on glass as vows were answered in polite clapping. Then there was a phrase, barely more than a breath, uttered by the woman beside me in a voice that had been trained to be smaller than the rooms it inhabited. It sounded like an old contract spoken out of the mouth of a living thing. The lights dimmed a fraction. Somewhere in the stone, a door slipped into place. I married her. I will always be the man who says that first. It both absolves and condemns. It is the simplest accounting of a life collapsed into a single ledger entry. I married her. Everything before that sentence reads like preparation, education, dinners in private rooms, a life smoothed by staff and reputation. Everything after it is a series of reckonings. I was raised in rooms that valued appearances above all else. My parents taught me to move through gatherings without making trouble, to laugh in measured places, to have an anecdote ready that could be sacrificed for the good of the table. Success in our circles was inherited like a property line. We tended it with caretakers and lawyers, with plates and patronage. I learned early that sometimes you must answer for the family ledger before you answer for hunger or affection. It left me with a particular hunger of my own, not for gold, but for being seen as something more than a carrying case for a name. Isabella found me at the charity gala, where wealthy people like to be photographed doing good. I remember the room in violet haze, the champagne cooling by the ice bucket like a patient. She moved differently from the rest of the women there, less the practiced angle of a portrait, more an apparition that arrived without announcement. She was not flustered by the cameras. She was indifferent. When she turned toward me, her face was open in a way that made me forget the choreography of conversation I had been taught. She said simply, "Tell me something true about yourself." That question was a small violence. I had been socialized to recite safe truths, my philanthropy, the art I collected, the discreet schools my children would someday attend. But the question opened a rift. I told her I was tired of being performance. I told her I wanted to be something a little messier, a life that belonged to my chest instead of to my name. She listened. She offered, without ceremony or salesmanship, an attention that felt like rescue. In the months that followed, that attention became the currency of our private life. Courtship with her was swift and precise. There were no showy declarations, no confetti storms. She presented me with books, dusty editions of obscure laws, treatises with marginalia written by hands long dead, rather than orchids. She would disappear sometimes for days and return with the faint scent of places I could not identify. She did not allow photography. When a friend tried to take her picture, the camera, one of those smooth, modern things that rarely missed, produced a pale gray rectangle where her face should have been. She disliked bright light on her features and loved the hush of late libraries. I liked that about her. It made the relationship feel like a private rebellion. There were oddities that I might have dismissed as idiosyncrasy if my family had not been the sort to hold secrets like heirlooms. It began with the prenuptial. Lawyers are a noisy species in my social world. They refer to numbers the way priests refer to scripture. Our lawyer, an elderly man who smelled always of pipe tobacco and old paper, handed me a copy of the draft with a tremor in his fingers I had never before seen from him. He read aloud phrases that belonged in archives: covenant, perpetuity, bloodline. He squinted at passages scrawled in a hand older than his typewriter. "It reads like a lease," he muttered, though the room was only our townhouse, and he did not need to speak softly. "But the signature line. It's not merely a signature." I remember the ledger I found afterward, not hidden but left as if to be found, pages loosened and lit by a solitary lamp. Yellowed papers folded against themselves, ink gone to a scab of brown, a seal stamped with a crest so old its lines had blurred. There were entries of gifts, bequests, curious notations that read like a balance sheet for people in influence. Continuation to heir, maintenance of favor in the city, obligations executed by the keeper. One page, which burned a small hole in my flesh as if the ink still carried heat, contained a clause in language that throbbed with ceremony. It did not name any divinity I recognized. It named a process, the binding of stewardship to lineage, activated by named words within a consecrated frame. I will say this plainly because we are people who prefer to sit with the easy stories. No one handed me a glowing sign. There were drafts and ledgers and whispers and finally, the altar. And yet, between the ledgers and the altar, there was a soft insistence in her, an exhaustion and a patience that had nothing to do with my world of galas and tycoons. When she spoke of history, she did not claim it as triumph. She recited it as obligation. "Your family has always paid for continuity," she said once at the end of a night when we were both feverish from something that felt like hope. There was no accusation in her voice, only a tiredness. "It made you possible." "I am not sure I wanted the possibility constructed this way," I said. "You did not say no. There is an arithmetic to our choices that often reveals itself only after the ledger has been balanced." I had wanted to be seen. I had been promised sight, or I had believed myself promised. The prenuptial contained more than clauses about assets. Tucked between paragraphs of estate taxes and guardianship there was ceremonial language, phrases that could be dismissed as antique if you wanted to dismiss them. No one wanted to dismiss them. No one wanted to ask the obvious question in a room full of whispers. What does it mean to be bound to a lineage not by blood alone, but by obligation enacted at a sacrament? By the time we stood before the altar, my world trembled on a hinge. The cathedral itself seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the skyline of the city glinted like distant teeth. Inside, stone murmured around us. She wore, beneath the silk and lace, a small band of iron that seemed more like a relic than jewelry. The ring we exchanged was not the soft gold my friends would have bought. It was cool as riverstone and heavy like a legal seal. When I slid it on, a flash of heat, sharp and sudden, bit my skin. The sensation was not pain so much as a recognition, like a letter recognized by the hand of a reader. The officiant's voice moved through the text, and somewhere between "for better" and that archaic clause my name blurred into the noise of the room. Pictures on the walls, faces in the crowd, shifted into other faces, faces that had been there before me. I saw brides in old black and white frames step forward into the light. Women in crinolines, women with short-cropped hair from some uncertain decade, women who wore grave expressions that had been rehearsed across generations. Their mouths opened and closed with the same set of words, unwitting and imperative. The air tasted like weather from another season. The light flattered and then betrayed us, making edges sharp and flat at once. Isabella spoke then, not with any passion I had been taught to love, but with a precision that made the hairs on my neck stand upright. She said something that had been written elsewhere, in other ink, to other hands. The phrase itself grated against the modern language in the program. It was ceremonial in cadence, a naming of histories and stewards and obligations, the syllables threaded like stitches into a garment. At that moment, everything cognitive in me arranged itself into comprehension. The cathedral's hum deepened. I felt threads, metaphorical and somehow also physical, tighten around me. There was a pressure at the center of my chest, a tick in the spaces where heartbeats measure themselves. and the ring warmed again until it threatened to fuse with my skin. The steward who had stood beside Isabella, who until then had been nothing more than an elegant absentee in tailored velvet, became visible to me in a different way. Her shadow, no, not a shadow, a silhouette like the ruin of a crown, rose behind her. It was not monstrous. It was inevitable. I was not seeing what the guests saw. Cameras continued to click, and guests smiled for photographs, unaware of the temporal fissure widening like a seam being unpicked. For me, the cathedral folded into a depth populated by the signatures of our family. Names of people who had bargained, traded, and signed away things that could not be repurchased. I understood then that our marriage was not a union of two people alone, but an activation of a contract that had been cared for like a garden for generations. The steward, Isabella, carried the role of keeper. She was older than she let on, not in the way wrinkles mark age, but in an accumulation of duty. In private, she sometimes spoke of names I did not recognize. She read from volumes that were not books, but records. Her hands held themselves apart from all the waves of the modern world. She had been shaped to steward bargains. And yet there was something else, a private grief that she allowed me to glimpse in late hours. A knowledge of the cost such stewarding required. She did not want me to be bound as the heirs before me had been. Perhaps this was why she would not be photographed. Perhaps it was why she recoiled from bright light. Perhaps she had learned that exposure invited activation. When the Covenant's mechanism engaged, it did not do so with the rhetoric of folklore. It was bureaucratic and brutal in its efficiency. Words were spoken like clauses and registered like entries. The ring seared. The air sang with a chord that was not music, but recognition. I saw, in staccato succession, a ledger being filled. Names appeared and vanished. Brides of our line folded into the present, as if time were a seam where men and women could be pinned for perpetuity. She, Isabella, hesitated only once. Not for lack of knowledge, she had known perhaps for centuries in the sense of intervals her memory could stretch, but with a human's sudden panic at a close-up of their life. She looked at me as if measuring whether the boy who had wanted to be seen would remain, now that he was being gated by an old architecture of obligation. I saw in her face a long performance of restraint, and under it, the exhaustion of someone who had enforced continuance one signature at a time. She could have completed the covenant. She could have enforced it in the ceremonious way the family had relied upon for generations. Assure the binding, ensure the line, perpetuate the node of influence. That would have been easier for all of us who feared the sudden loss of status. It would have kept the machine of patronage humming, but she did something else. Instead of turning the mechanism outward, binding me, my descendants, a calendar of obedience, she turned it inward. She began to absorb the contract as if swallowing the pages whole. Perhaps she could do this because she had been keeper of the clauses. Perhaps she could do it because stewardship granted her a kind of immunity to the forces the contract exerted. I do not know the metaphysics of my family's bargains. I do know the sequence of what followed. When she bent to take on the covenant, the cathedral reacted. Light stuttered. The chandeliers flashed with a vertical pain. I felt the ledger's weight in my chest as if the centuries of expectations had been poured into my ribcage by invisible hands. Isabella's fingers, those delicate, precise hands that had never once become clumsy, pressed against her temple. Her face shifted in a way that made my rational mind try to explain it away as a medical event. Later, hospital tests would find nothing they could declare. Later, reporters would call it an electrical surge or a temporary dissociation. In the moment, I watched my future, and, in a sense, my past, snap like a taut string. The absorbing was not loud in the way we imagine cosmic events to be. It was intimate, and intimateness is always more violent than spectacle. There was a sound, I think, like paper being torn at the base of a voice. The steward's body shimmered with an internalizing light that was not white so much as concentrated memory. Where the ring had sealed to my skin, seams of light threaded up her arms and into her, as if the obligations themselves were entering her veins. She bent and her spine arched as if 1,000 small thorns were being drawn into her flesh by memory. "Not this way," she mouthed, and for once the archaic cadence left her voice. It was raw. It was human. The crowd moved around us like tidewater. Some people noticed the change in atmosphere and looked at one another with curiosity, or perhaps the thrill of a story entering their laps. Most did not understand. They expected ornamental drama at such gatherings. The steward's face contorted not into something monstrous, but into the slow collapse you give to a person who has been carrying a weight they have never been permitted to set down. I tried to reach for her hand and failed. The ring's heat drove a line of light across my palm. For the first time, I felt what the claws meant. A binding not easily broken. It was intended to be a chain that threaded a family together. Each generation a link. Each link bearing a promise of continuation. Isabella had decided, against the centuries of precedent, to become the breaker. Her body shook as the covenant's memory passed through her. I saw flashes, faces of women who had given themselves to the line, men who had signed agreements in the service of reputation, children who had been raised to carry a mantle like a hot coal, and she inhaled them as if they were smoke. Then, as if all the voices had been poured into a funnel, and the funnel into a single throat, the steward shouted. Not a sound meant to communicate across the hall, but a cry that felt like an indictment of time. What happened next could be described in any number of idioms. She burned, she dissolved, she aged. None of these are wholly true. It resembled aging in that her composure unspooled, and in its place things that looked like vulnerability arrived. It resembled burning in that her outer form became less coherent, as if the light had eaten the edges that kept her aloof. It resembled dissolving in that people later said the light around her was photographed as a smear of white on journalists' reels. But mostly it resembled an ending rendered by choice. As the covenant's pages were absorbed into her, the mechanism that had linked us clattered and faltered. The ring cooled. The pressure in my chest lessened as if a hand that had been squeezing my ribs had withdrawn. There was a silence that shivered like the moment after thunder. The steward's stance lost those centuries of practiced alertness. She folded like someone finally allowed to lay down a burden you did not know they had carried. The cost was absolute. She did not survive that night in the form she had been. She did not become the tired, lived-in lover I had been promised when I had wanted a messy, human life. The steward's immortality, if that is the right word, was fractured and given over. Her body changed. For those who watched closely, the edges of the person they had loved blurred into a softness that had not existed before. Her voice, once an instrument of measured duty, slipped into tremulousness when she addressed me. "Forgive me," she said, and it was not a phrase meant for ceremony. It was an apology that read like a ledger entry being closed. I could not let it continue. She did not die in the bright, cinematic way the movies suggest. Instead, she unmade whatever there had been that allowed the covenant to persist, without shocking the form we accepted as life. There was light, yes. There was also a long, slow release of something that had held her taut. People later said she seemed to exhale like someone who had held their breath for decades. The immediate aftermath was as shock can be. Practical, distancing, and self-preserving. Guests murmured about power failures and the perils of old wiring. My family, trained in legacies and continuity, tried already to assemble an explanation that would fit into polite columns. An unfortunate event, an anomaly. Lawyers carted away the drafts and the ledgers. The townhouses exchanged quiet telephone calls in the days that followed, in which phrases were chosen to be as neutral as paper. The press did what press does. They made an event into a headline and a marketable mystery. It was convenient for everyone to call it a glitch, but there was also the internal economy of consequence. The family fortune did not vanish, nor did our social standing evaporate. What changed was the rate at which things were multiplied. Money, when untempered by a covenant that demanded continuance, does not automatically expand as if under its own magnet. Our assets stabilized. Investments that had been enchanted, so to speak, by a promise of preferment cooled into conservatory returns. Donors who had contributed in anticipation of an ongoing influence withdrew, and we were forced, horrifyingly humanizing, to find new terms for our philanthropy. Children would no longer be readied as inheritors of an automatic seat at the table of patronage. We stopped planning for generational domination and started planning for actual needs. For me, the social consequences were a relief and a wound. There were mornings when I woke and felt both a gratitude I could not wholly earn and a grief for the form of her I had thought I might keep. The steward had given up a role that had been part of her being, as surely as my name was part of mine. She had made space in which I could finally choose. Critics who write cheaply about fate will insist that the steward's sacrifice was inevitable, that people bound to duty always choose to save others at personal cost. I resist that easy reading because it simplifies human motive into a trope. Maria, our ex-lawyer's sister, she who liked to say contract law was the last standing religion of the modern oligarch, murmured that perhaps Isabella had always been more than our steward. Perhaps she had been an instrument of revolt. That is not satisfying either. People are always more than our metaphors for them. In the months after, we tried, clumsily, to rearrange our lives. The family wealth flattened into more ordinary lines. We sold property off in ways that felt like admitting to a simpler future. The staff reduced. Events became rarer. I moved differently in rooms. It is strange how much of our bodily carriage is auto-tuned to the expectations of our names. Without the promise of automatic ascendancy, lunches were less frequent. I found myself buying groceries on a Wednesday at a market near my apartment and listening to a woman ask me about my favorite bread. The world was oddly larger for being less ceremonious. Isabella disappeared from public life. It seemed natural. One does not show a wound like the one she had tended in full light. For some months, she wrote me letters that read like marginalia to a life anew. Small, precise observations about the weather, about the quality of light in a room at a certain hour. She sent me a book with a note that said, "Read this at dawn," and within its margins she had circled passages about harvest and gratitude. I visited her in apartments that smelled of tea and drying paper, and she answered my questions about her past with a casualness that had once been impossible. She had traded a form of endless obligation for fragility. People who had loved the idea of our grandeur fretted and then moved on. Those who had once envied the shine in my name also discovered how subject it was to earthly vicissitudes, and some liked me better for the change. There is a cruelty to fortune that often disguises itself as kindness. When your ledger is smaller, you must witness the humanity of those you would have once purchased to cover the edges. I began to learn to look at people without the calculus of leverage. It is a painful but honest exercise. A year passed, and then another. We, Isabella and I, attended small dinners that did not cost more than one of the old galas, but in which laughter was conversational rather than performative. I learned the shape of her hands without being afraid that if I traced a line of her palm, I would awaken an ancestral clause. She had been altered by what she had taken into herself, altered not only in body, but in the way she allowed herself to be seen. There was more of a tremor to her voice at times, and there were moments when she would look at a ledger with a kind of horror I did not understand. For the most part, though, she practiced a new kind of attendance. To the taste of coffee, to the names of neighbors, to the small details of a life once considered mundane. I often thought about the brides whose faces had walked through the cathedral as apparitions the day we married, the women whose signatures she had swallowed and whose obligations she had absorbed. For them, there had been no choice. For her, there had been an act of refusal, executed with grace and a fierceness that I do not think I had the imagination to ask of anyone. It is not noble to demand sacrifice. It is noble to accept it on behalf of the rest of the family, and then, having done so, to ask nothing in return. She did not ask for anything, then or after. She asked, much later, for something so simple, I almost missed its import. We returned to the cathedral a year later. The anniversary was a private thing. The altar was the same altar, the stone weathered by the formal footsteps of those whose business it had been to come to such places. The chandeliers no longer startled when the city lights rose. The roof was quiet. We were there because promises require witnesses, even if the promises are private. I had told myself it was to see whether the place would remember us. She came quietly, wearing clothes that fit the angle of ordinary life. The light found her differently. There was a softness to her edges, a way her jaw no longer held the taut line it had once been, as if all the tensile strength that had kept her form fixed had, in the act of sacrifice, loosened. Her eyes were not empty. They were, astonishingly, human. She blinked at least 4 times as we sat in the rear pew. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, the small wet click between eyelid and eye. When she turned to me, she was not the steward who had held a family's covenant. She was the woman who had carried a scar invisible to everyone else, but woven into the narrative of her movements. She reached for my hand as a person asks for warmth. "Would you choose me?" she asked, "without a contract?" It is a question that is simple and monumental at once. It is not merely framed for romantic effect. It is a question about the nature of consent after the heat of contractual obligation has been dissipated. It asks whether the attachments formed in the shadow of power can exist in their softened form, whether someone who has been loved as a mechanism can, in their new finitude, be loved as a person. I could not answer immediately because the question demanded an inventory of all the ways I had been taught to value appearances. It demanded I look at myself and see whether I had ever loved the idea of being loved or the love itself. A man with a name like mine learns to translate the world into value. I had to undo a ledger. I thought of all the brides who had been signatures, of the ledger's rusted pages, of the taste of legal parchment on the tongue of the room. I thought of the steward bending beneath a century's worth of obligation and taking it into herself not to maintain our dominance, but to end it. "Yes," I said eventually. It was not more elaborate than that. The word was small and huge at once. It carried all the years we had both navigated, all the ways we had been taught to be of value to others, and all the ways we had chosen, nonetheless, to try to be human. She smiled, and it was like a page turning. There was a softness to the curve, to the rearrangement of muscles that had once been invisible. We had, in defiance of centuries of precedent, invented a new economy of belonging. It had nothing to do with receipts and everything to do with small mercies. Tea made in the morning, a hand taken in the dark, a laugh aloud. You will ask, perhaps, what became of the public narrative of our wedding. What did the papers say after the initial frenzy drained into the mundane? Reporters speculated. They always do. There were pieces about electrical surges, about the presiding clergyman's old ties to forgotten societies, about the philanthropic consequences of an aristocratic household's transformation. Gossip magazines ran thin stories about couples who had been forced to reboot their brand. Some of this was cruel, some of it banal. Most of the world preferred a tidy explanation for the things that make us uncomfortable. But not everyone wanted a tidy explanation. Some people, those who had been invited in by the small, ordinary kindnesses that replaced the fireworks of our old life, stayed. They saw, with an unpracticed eye, that the man who had once taken pride in being untroubled by the public now found a kind of joy in learning a new competence: how to be present to people without the buffer of reputation. They watched Isabella in the quiet of markets and laundromats, and lent an ear to the way she sometimes recited lines from books, not because they were rare, but because they fit a mood. The steward had become a thing of the past in the public's mind. The person beside me had returned to the shape of a human being. There are costs to redemption. There are strange, unoccupied rooms where obligations had once hung like portraits. There are a few members of my family who never forgave the loss of ceremony, as if they had been robbed of a joy uniquely theirs. There are also neighbors who appreciated our willingness to donate not for power, but for the satisfaction of repairing infrastructure. There are children who now enroll in schools not because of advantageous connections, but because of available resources. These are small victories, but they are real. When the press asked what it had been like to watch Isabella make that choice, I said very little. Words are always poor in the face of acts that rearrange the moral geography of a life. I took less credit than the cameras suggested. I had loved her, yes, and there is no small moral confusion in admiring a sacrifice that had been made ostensibly for you. But love, as we discovered, is not the currency of indemnity. It is a practice of choosing again, every ordinary day. There was a period when I haunted the townhouse where ledgers had once been ceremonially kept. I walked through rooms like a man ashamed of the spaces his name had occupied. I met with lawyers who had grown wise and fragile. We restructured givings. We agreed to no longer accept the automatic promises of facilitation that had been the backbone of old deals. We broke up some of the trusts that had been created precisely to shield new generations from the humbling effects of the marketplace. My father's face, once so steady, showed cracks. He died within a few years with a sense of loss and an odd, delayed pride that one of his descendants had found something more human in which to place their affection. As for Isabella, she kept a small room above a bookshop for a while. It was the sort of place where tea was brewed in a chipped pot, and where neighbors would press small gifts: jars of honey, a loaf of bread. She grew a habit of carrying a list in a small notebook. Names of people to remember, not names of donors, but names of those who had been generous in the small ways that make up a life. She would sometimes sit on the back steps of the shop and watch children hurry by with their pockets full of a city's small ambitions. It pleased her. It was, she told me once, better than the chandeliers. Do not mistake this for a tale of uncomplicated catharsis. There were nights when the old clauses crept back in dreams. I would awake with the taste of old paper on my tongue and the memory of a ledger that had been unrolled across the bed. Isabella would wake as well, and we would sit together until the edges of night smoothed into the small light at the windowsill. We learned to name fear without allowing it to drive our decision-making. We learned, clumsily and with patience, the arithmetic of a life built on choices rather than on inherited obligation. When people ask me now what I would have done differently, I find the question both tender and impossible. If I had known the ledger's exact footprint earlier, would I have still chosen to marry her? Would I have chosen at all? The forms by which we are asked to choose are often less about what we choose and more about the architecture that makes choice possible. One thing I know: the desire to be known as human is both ordinary and incendiary. It compelled me. It required, in the end, an act of courage that was, for once, not mine to give. I married her, and she was not what I had expected, because she was not only a woman but a steward, a repository, a piece of a family's mechanism. She was also, impossibly, and finally, herself. She taught me that to be bound is not the same as to be beloved, and that to unbind requires an imaginative and physical labor that cannot be performed by ledger entries or lawyers alone. It requires a refusal of convenience and an acceptance of loss. In the quieter hours, when the city is a distant hum and the books on the shelf cast long shadows, she will sometimes look up at me with a small expression that asks, in the simplest human grammar, if I am still in. Not in the sense of property or obligation, but in the sense of companionship for its own sake. There are no legalese phrases then, no antique clauses moored to the edge of our speech. There is only the considerable, self-evident difficulty of staying. "Would you choose me without a contract?" she asked once more on our 10th anniversary, and it was not a test so much as an offering. I took her hand. There is a certain weight to touch when touch is freed from the metallic ring of the ceremonial and the spectral ledger. The feeling of being chosen into is a small crystalline mercy. I said again, without ledger or ceremony, "Yes, if you like slow-burning stories about power, choice, and the cost of inherited privilege, and you want more tales where people learn to be human in the wake of their family's legacies, hit subscribe." I tell these stories because someone must account for the things we've accepted as tradition. We never fully escape the past. The cathedral stones still hold some echo of our altar. There are nights when the wind around the townhouse seems to carry the whisper of clauses. But when I look at the woman beside me now, blinking, laughing at something small, reaching for the rim of her teacup with fingers that have learned to tremble with feeling rather than duty, I am convinced of one thing. What binds us today is not the rubric of inheritance, but the stubborn, ordinary desire to be with one another in the present. There will always be temptations to return to the old ledger. There will always be corridors in which men and women will make bargains for power. I have watched both the machinery and its ruin. I have seen both the dignity of a steward who refused to perpetuate harm and the precariousness of a family, learning to live within its new limitations. If there is a moral here, it is not tidy. It is the messy truth that love made without coercion is both more fragile and more durable than we often suppose. Once, in the quiet back shelf of the bookshop, Isabella found a photograph she had not known she kept. It was faded to the point of being a suggestion. An old bride whose gown was captured in a way that made her look both joyous and resigned. Isabella held it between two fingers and explained nothing. She put it back on the shelf like a relic tended without worship. She had not become less. She had become different. I married her, the woman who did not blink in a cathedral of gold, and through the act that night she rewrote the accountings of our family. She did not seek my gratitude. She sought only to unmake an architecture of obligation that, for generations, had made people into means rather than ends. I try each day to be the kind of person who deserves her answer. If you enjoyed this story, there are more like it in the playlist. Consider watching the next one for another slow-burning tale of consequences and choices.